Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. The government has taken great heart from a recent periodic labour force survey which suggests that there's been a marked fall in unemployment. But is that really the true picture? Or when you look deeper and closer, does a substantially different picture emerge? That's the key issue I should explore today with a senior visiting fellow at ICRIER and one of the country's foremost labour economists, Radhicka Kapoor. Radhicka Kapoor, let me start by asking you to explain two terms that will crop up fairly frequently in our discussion, but with which the audience is completely unfamiliar. I refer to the usual status approach as well as the weekly status approach for calculating unemployment. Can you explain what do those two terms mean?
Yes. So, Karan, the periodic labour force survey, which is an annual household survey undertaken by the government to understand the conditions of employment and unemployment in India, is what we'll be discussing today. Now, what happens in this survey is that we basically go and ask people what their activity status is. And by activity status, what I mean is that we ask them that, are you in the labor force or are you out of the labor force? If you're in the labor force, are you employed? Are you working and therefore employed? Or are you seeking and available for work, so you're unemployed? Then if you're employed, there are more detailed questions asked about their activity status, whether they are in a certain sector, what type of employment they're doing. Now, when all these questions are asked about their activity status, they have to be posed with respect to a reference period. So we either ask them to describe their activity status with respect to the last 365 days. So that's a reference period of 1 year. And the estimates of employment and unemployment that we get from there are called the usual status measures. At the same time, we also collect information from them where we record their activity status for a week. So that's the last 7 days preceding the date of the survey. So the employment and unemployment estimates that you get based on that are called the current weekly status measures.
So in a nutshell, the usual status approach compares their present position to what it has been over the last 365 days, i.e. the last year. And the weekly status approach compares their present position to what it was roughly over the last 7 days a week ago. Is that a correct summing up?
Absolutely.
Now, in a recent article for the Indian Express, you wrote, and I'm quoting you, in developing countries where casual, part-time and temporary jobs are widespread, employment estimates based on the usual status approach tend to include the underemployed workforce and therefore give a misleading picture. Does that mean that the usual status approach includes underemployed people, i.e. people with jobs that are not full-time jobs, and therefore suggests a much larger proportion as being fully employed, whereas the truth is they are not fully employed?
Absolutely. So the way the usual status is defined, basically to be classified as unemployed as per that definition, you would pretty much have to be chronically unemployed for the last 365 days. But what we know in India is that there are a lot of people who are engaged in casual, part-time work, irregular work, intermittent work. So there would be very few people who would actually be chronically unemployed for that entire duration. And so what the usual status approach essentially does is that it counts all these underemployed people as employed and therefore gives a lower unemployment rate and presents a slightly misleading picture of the extent of labor underutilization in the economy.
And that presumably therefore means that for a country like India, a much more accurate picture is presented by the weekly status approach.
Well, that's it's not one way or the other like that, I think, because firstly, I mean, like I said, the usual status tells you your activity status over the last 1 year. Now, because you're getting people's activity status over a long reference period, that measure is inherently smoother. You will not capture changes in their activity pattern due to seasonal factors or if there's short-term disruptions like the lockdowns we've seen last year. So as a result of that, the usual status measure is relatively smooth, and the current weekly status measure is able to capture these seasonal variations and therefore is accurate in situations like this. But having said this, before these employment-unemployment surveys started in India in the 70s, there was a lot of thought which was put into these issues and what would be the right approach to measure employment. And at that time, there was a committee called the Dantwala Committee, which said that, given the diversity and the complexity of the employment relationships in India, no one measure alone is adequate to understand the employment scenario in the country. So they said that there have to be three measures. There was usual status, there was the current weekly status, and there was the current daily status. And we can keep the current daily status out for now so we don't complicate things. But basically, all the NSS surveys have consistently produced employment and unemployment estimates based on all these measures. Now, while these estimates are reported in the surveys, the policy discourse and the conversation around employment in India invariably revolves around the usual status. So what I was basically trying to say in that article was that you also need to pay more attention to the current weekly status. We can't have the entire discourse dominated just by the usual status, A, because you're factoring in the underemployed, and B, because you want to take into account changes in activity patterns due to seasonal factors.
So therefore, don't focus your attention entirely on the usual status. You must temper and judge usual status in terms of the weekly status as well. You need a combination of two, not a unilateral focus just on the usual status report. Then with this in the background, let's talk about what the Periodic Labour Force Survey has recently suggested about the unemployment rate. Now, going by the usual status approach, the unemployment rate has fallen from 6.1% in 2017-18 to 4.8% in 2019-20. And that sounds like a fairly substantial fall. But when you bear in mind what the weekly status approach is suggesting, you get a different picture. As you point out in your article, the weekly status approach suggests that unemployment is at 8.8%, which is substantially higher. And perhaps equally importantly, it hasn't shown much decline. So in other words, the extent to which the government draws comfort by focusing almost unilaterally on the usual status approach, that is not a convincing image of the economy because the weekly status suggests a different picture.
Absolutely. And having said that, Karan, we're looking at this 4.8% unemployment rate by the usual status. We're comparing it to the 6.1%, and that looks like an improvement. But what we're still saying is that even with this very relaxed definition of an unemployment rate, where we are counting all the underemployed also as employed, we still have an unemployment rate which is almost touching 5%. And let me also tell you that even if you look just at the usual status measures and you slice and dice it across different age groups and education levels, the youth unemployment rate, even by the usual status, as per the 2019-20 survey, stands at 15%. So there's not much to draw hard from here. And as far, like you said, with the current weekly status, that actually hasn't budged at all since 2017-18. And that's been flat at 8.8, 8.9%. So there's really nothing which is promising in these numbers.
I want to underline that last point because I think it's very important. The weekly status approach has shown unemployment at 8.8, 8.9% since roughly 2017-18 onwards. It's been stuck at that figure. And that figure is a very high figure. It's not one that you can easily push aside.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, in fact, you've gone one step further. You've also examined the composition of the workforce in terms of different types of employment. And the first thing you've noticed is that the share of self-employment has increased fairly substantially. And within self-employed workers, the share that's gone up perhaps the most is that of unpaid family workers. What does this combination tell you about the sort of jobs people are doing?
Right. So before I answer that question, let me just tell you a little bit about why this is an important exercise to do when you're looking at labor force statistics in India. Looking in most other countries, if you look at the unemployment rate alone, it's a fairly adequate metric to understand what's happening in the labor market. But in developing economies like India, where basically the cost of remaining unemployed is too high, especially because you don't have any unemployment allowance, people resort to all sorts of work when they can't find a good job. They'll create work, so they become self-employed, or they start doing any kind of odd job that comes their way, so they become casual workers. So essentially, the unemployment rate alone is inadequate to understand what is happening, and we need to dig a bit deeper and understand what the distribution of employment looks like and what kind of work people are doing. Now, what the NSS and the PLFS surveys do is that they broadly divide people who are working into three groups. The first group is that of regular salaried workers. The second is casual workers. And the third is self-employed workers. Now, the casual workers are really at the bottom of the pyramid because these are the people who are doing, drawing wages on a daily basis or some periodic work contract. They don't have regular income. So they're at the bottom. Their wages are very low. Their financial vulnerability is exacerbated by the fact that they don't get work on every single day of the month. Then at the top, you basically have these regular salaried jobs, which are the good jobs in the economy. And here too, we're able to collect information from the NSS surveys on whether these people, these regular salaried workers, have access to social security benefits or not. So we decompose that group into two categories. They are the regular formal workers, so those who are in regular salaried jobs and have access to social security. And then they're the regular informal workers who don't have access to social security. So that's the second broad group. And then finally, you have this group of self-employed people, which is where bulk of employment in India is concentrated because they've typically accounted for over 50% of the total workforce. And within this self-employed group also, there's heterogeneity. So on the one hand, you have people who are called employers. And these are basically the job creators. They account for roughly 2% of the workforce. So we can keep them out of the discussion for now. And then you have own account workers, who are basically people running household enterprises, but without any hired workers. And then the third group is this category of unpaid family helpers. So these are the people who are working in their household enterprises, but they're not actually drawing any wages. And within the group of self-employed, these unpaid family workers are basically the most vulnerable type of workers. Now, with this backdrop, let me tell you what's happening in the 1920 data. Now, as you mentioned, what we've basically seen is that between 2018-19 and 2019-20, we see a decline in the share of regular salaried workers. And this is really quite disturbing because if you look at the data over the last few years, the share of these kind of workers has been rising. Between 2011-12 and 18-19, that share of regular salaried workers increased from about 18% to 24%, and now it's declined. What is more, even within this category of regular salaried workers, the percentage of workers who are not eligible for social security benefits has increased, which means that you have more regular informal jobs. So while you're seeing this shift away from regular wage salaried work, you're concomitantly seeing an increase in self-employment. And within this group of self-employed, what you're finding is that there are more people who are moving into the category of unpaid family helpers, which, as I said, was the most vulnerable type of self-employment. And that's something which is really quite worrying. So in the 2019-20 data, almost about 16% of your workforce is in this vulnerable type of self-employment, which is unpaid family workers. And what's really alarming is that when you look at that number for the youth, that is as high as 25%. So what that's telling you is that about a quarter of India's young workforce in 2019-20 was in the category of unpaid family helpers.
In a nutshell, what you're saying is that an increasing proportion of people who had regular salaried employment are now losing it and are forced to become self-employed workers. And within that category of self-employed workers, the increasing majority are unpaid family workers. So people are regressing down the value chain of employment, moving from good salaried jobs to self-employment where they're creating jobs, and then sometimes even further down to unpaid family workers, where at best they're doing part-time jobs, not getting paid, and they're only there because a family member is letting them join in. So there's a regression in terms of employment happening, and that is a very worrying concern. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And you also made another point specifically about youth employment, and I want to just highlight that. You said that whereas the weekly status of unemployment is 8.8% for youth, it's as high as 15%. And if you look at the proportion of youth who are actually working as unpaid family workers, right at the very bottom end of the scale, the proportion is 25%. So both in terms of outright unemployment and in terms of the poor quality of the employment that they're managing to get, the youth are at the bottom end.
Yes, so the youth unemployment rate as of the usual status stands at 15%, which is very high. And even if you look at the kind of work the youth are engaged in, a quarter of the young workforce is in this vulnerable type of self-employment.
Now, in fact, there is something else that you've mentioned in your article, which I think is worth looking at, and that is the point that there are three categories of self-employment. You mentioned them in your early answer, but I'll just repeat them again. In addition to unpaid family workers, there are also employers who run their own enterprise, and then there are employers who hire labor. Clearly, employers who run their enterprise and employers who hire labor are at the upper end of self-employment, but these two categories in percentage terms are shrinking. What is growing is unpaid family work. So what's happening is within the self-employed category, the better end is shrinking, the insecure, uncertain end is growing. That itself is pretty telling, isn't it?
Absolutely. And even what we are calling as the better end of the self-employed, or what you're calling the own account workers who run enterprises without any hired labor, and the employers, it's important to note that a lot of people are actually in this own account worker category simply because they couldn't find any good jobs. And so they had to resort to self-employment as a means of survival. So, we're being very generous actually in a way when we're using the term better for some of these own account workers.
Absolutely. What we call the better end is not something that people have opted for and preferred and chosen out of volition. It's what they're forced to do because they've lost better regular salary paid jobs. It's not an option they wanted. It's a default they've fallen into. Now,
it's not something that they're doing out of choice, but because there is no other choice.
Now, alongside this, there's also been an increase in the share of employment in agriculture, and that's a fairly substantial increase. It's gone up from 42.5% in 2018-19 to 45.6% in 2019-20. And as you write in that Indian Express article, it's the first time that the share of agriculture in total employment in percentage terms has increased since the NSS surveys started. But since employment in agriculture tends to be last resort employment, isn't this in fact an indication of distress? People have lost other better jobs and they are falling back on agriculture to sustain themselves. This is not something they've again opted to do out of preference.
Absolutely. So, if you track the sectoral breakdown of employment in the NSS surveys, what we see consistently, and this is happening consistently up until 2018-19, that the share of agriculture in employment is falling. And that's really a good thing because that is the kind of structural transformation you expect to be happening in a developing economy where people will basically exit low productivity jobs in the agricultural sector and they should be moving into more high productivity jobs in the non-agricultural sector. And this is really the first time in the data that we are seeing an increase in percentage terms. I'm reinforcing that. Between 2018-19 and 2019-20. And that number now stands at about 45.6%, which is really quite high. And at the same time, what you're seeing is that, sectors like construction, manufacturing, they have witnessed a decline in the share of employment. So that kind of marks a reversal in the sort of structural transformation that we've been witnessing in India over the years. Now, of course, manufacturing has never quite performed well in terms of employment, and its share in employment has never exceeded 12%. But this year, it's declined even more. Construction, which has been a very important source of job creation in India post 2004-5, has also witnessed some decline. And what these numbers are broadly telling you is that as the other sectors in the economy are failing to create jobs at a rapid enough pace, people are being pushed back into the agricultural sector. So agriculture is, in a sense, like you said, an employer of last resort, or even a reservoir of surplus labor in the economy, because you have about 40% of employment in the agricultural sector, but in 2019-20, agriculture accounted for just about 15% of gross value added. So that in itself is reflective of the low productivity.
And in fact, if one digs deeper, the picture that emerges even in the agricultural sector is yet more depressing, because as you point out, much of the increase in the agricultural sector is through the category of unpaid family workers. Their share has gone up from 25.7% to 29.7%. So something very similar to what we earlier noted in terms of non-agricultural employment is also happening in terms of agricultural employment. It's the insecure, uncertain bottom end where it seems jobs and employment is increasing. The more secure upper end is shrinking.
Yes, I mean, agriculture in any case is largely dominated by the self-employed or by casual work. You don't see very many of these regular salary jobs in the agricultural sector. It's largely informal in nature. But even there, what you're seeing this year, as the statistics I point out in the article, are telling us that in this group of self-employed, there is a shift in the composition away from the own account and the employer's group towards the more precarious type of self-employment, which is unpaid family work. So not only is agriculture employment expanding, but it's also expanding at the bottom of, in terms of the quality employment, it's those which are at the bottom which are increasing.
And in fact, this is also reflected when you look at the fact that the percentage of rural women employed by agriculture has shot up pretty substantially. It's gone up from 71.1% in 2018-19 to 75.7% in 2019-20. But I take it, and I'm looking to you for confirmation, that these women are almost entirely working as unpaid family workers. They're not actually earning salaries that are remunerable.
So, Karan, there's so much that is actually coming out with this story about the statistics we are seeing about rural women. And there's a little more to it, actually, than what you said. One of, the well-documented facts in the literature is that the female labor force participation rates in rural India have not just been low, but they have been declining over time. And this is a very, very long-term trend. And there's a fascinating body of literature that tries to explain why this is happening. It's attributed sometimes to social and cultural norms, sometimes to the fact that women have to bear a disproportionate burden of household responsibilities. And there is some, it's fairly well established that a large part of the decline that we saw in female labor force participation rates in India, especially in rural areas, was because as household incomes increased, as husbands' incomes increased, women actually had the luxury of now withdrawing from the labor force. When you look at the data this year, between 2018-19 and 2019-20, you are seeing a very sharp increase in female labor force participation rate in rural areas. And that number is increasing from 26% to 33%. And this is a reversal of a very long-term decline that we've seen in female labor force participation rates in rural India. So this was actually a very interesting trend in the data. And when you look at it to begin with, it seemed like a positive development, because alongside the increase in labor force participation rate, you also saw a decline in the unemployment rate for rural females. So what this is telling you is that not only are more rural females entering the labor force, but they're also getting jobs. But then where are they getting these jobs? If you look there, that's basically pointing to the distress in the economy. The fact is that 75% of rural women were engaged in the agricultural sector. And that's a big jump from the share of women which were engaged in the agricultural sector in 2018-19. And when you then look at the distribution of employment within the agricultural sector for these women, you again see that that jump is largely happening in the category of unpaid family workers. So the share of women who are working as unpaid family workers in the agricultural sector in rural India has gone up to almost 53% from about 49% in 2018-19. And why this is so important is because this is pointing to the distress that is there in rural India. It's well known that when there's an economic crisis and household incomes collapse, more members of the family will try to work and contribute to the family income. So this increase that you're seeing, because of the kind of employment they're getting engaged in, is reflective of distress. They are not going towards better quality jobs.
I'll underline that because I think it's so very important. The fact that the number of women employed in agriculture has gone up pretty sharply is not a sign that actually they're venturing out and doing jobs and earning incomes and therefore asserting their economic independence. It's actually an indication of the distress their households are under. Household incomes have collapsed and women as a result are being forced to work, and they're working almost entirely as unpaid family workers. This is a sign of the distress rather than the success of employment. Let me then, against this background, put to you what is perhaps the conclusion that is emerging from our discussion and ask whether you agree with it. The government presents as a cover story the upfront, reasonably sharp fall in unemployment in terms of the usual status approach. But when you dig deeper and look at unemployment A in terms of the weekly status approach, and then you look at unemployment or the types of employment that are growing in terms of the composition of jobs, you suddenly discover that what is happening is a sharp increase in underemployment, a sharp increase in poor quality employment, and a very large increase in agricultural employment as a distress. And this wider, deeper, closer picture reflects actually a crisis of employment, not a success story. Is that a correct conclusion to draw?
It is indeed. And I think just to reflect on the conclusion, if you look, 2019-20, now the reference period for this survey is between July of 2019 and June of 2020. We know that GDP growth had declined substantially in 2019-20. In fact, between 2016-17 and 2019-20, it had halved. So there was a lot of distress in the economy already. Investment was collapsing. The periodic labor force data from 2017-18 has been telling us that there is a serious crisis of both unemployment and underemployment in the economy. And the picture that this data is presenting is that by this time, when we're capturing the data for 2019-20, and some of that includes the months of the first lockdown in 2020, there was so much distress in the economy that people were being pushed to do jobs which were low paying, which were vulnerable, which was precarious. So even though you are seeing a decline in the unemployment rate, that decline in the unemployment rate is masking a very serious problem of underemployment in the economy.
Now, the data on the basis of which we've had this discussion goes up to, as you said, June 2020. Do you have any sense of what has happened in the year thereafter? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, actually, it's not too early to tell, because when the government released this annual data, which is for the period 2019-20, it also released some quarterly data. The quarterly data comes only from urban India. And the quarterly data was for the period from July 2020 to September 2020. And there you're already seeing that there is an increase in the unemployment rate to 13%. And that's up from 8% in the same quarter the last year. So, this is a telling indicator. But more broadly, you have enough indicators that are telling you what's going to happen in the data next year. To begin with, I think we're reasonably sure that we're going to see a decline, an increase in the unemployment rate, because a lot of people have lost jobs during the lockdown and the COVID shock. So we can expect to see an increase in the unemployment rate, both by the usual status and by the current weekly status. What is even more worrying is that we are going to see a deterioration in the quality of employment for sure in the 2020 data, because a lot of people who've lost jobs, especially those who've lost these regular salary jobs, are unlikely to have found these jobs back in this year. And they would have been again be pushed into more precarious employment. They would be pushed into self-employment. Many of them would have found themselves also in the informal sector. So informality would have also increased over the last 1 year. And what's also worrying is that, all these effects that are happening in the labor market, a disproportionate burden of these would have been borne by those who are at the bottom and the middle of the earnings and the education distribution. Because these are people who are largely engaged in jobs which may not have given them the option of working from home or are amenable to online work, as opposed to people who are doing more skilled jobs. So there definitely is going to be widening disparity in the labor market. And finally, I think the biggest crisis is going to be vis-a-vis the youth, because we know from global evidence, and the ILO has been pointing to this, that the youth has actually borne a disproportionate burden of the crisis as well. So we are going to see youth unemployment increasing in the year to come. And what's worrying from that is that this might actually have a scarring effect on the career of the youth, in the sense that they might find themselves unemployed for a longer period of time, or even possibly a wage penalty in the future. And fourthly, I think we're also going to see a decline in the labor force participation rate in the 2020-21 data, because people would have withdrawn from the workforce simply because there was a health shock of COVID. But also, I suspect that there will be a discouraged worker participation effect, which means people would have just got frustrated after multiple job searches and they will just choose to withdraw from the workforce. So unfortunately, at the risk of being a pessimistic, I have to say that all these statistics are going to take a turn for the worse in the PLFS of 2020-21.
So to sum up, the situation that was already pretty depressing and concerning as of the end of June 2020 is likely to get worse. And you've identified 4 key reasons why that should be the case. And you've also cited the quarterly urban India data for the period July-September, which suggests that the unemployment rate, and I assume this is on the weekly basis rather than the usual basis, has risen from 8.8 to 13% and could rise higher. So an already worrying situation is going to end up becoming even worse.
Unfortunately, yes.
Radhicka Kapoor, thank you very much for explaining in such simple terms, but also with such convincing detail, a subject that most people want to know about, but find fearsome and difficult to understand. You've made it literally as easy as pumpkin pie. Thank you very much indeed. Take care.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.